raised in a small town in the center of the country, really, in Iowa, and without knowing that there was such a thing as a midwife. It sounds strange to say, if you're not from North America, but when you live in one of these two countries where the profession was totally obliterated, you tended to grow up without knowing. We didn't even have the stories from our great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was a midwife in the Iowa Prairie. But since it didn't pass on to the next generation and the next, we didn't hear those stories. So I came to have my first child after having got a master's degree in English and having served 2 years in the Peace Corps. So I traveled around the world a bit, and I knew that not everybody went to the hospital and did it with doctors, but then I didn't know anybody who hadn't either, So I got to have my first baby the only way you could have a baby in 1966. And it was a brutal, strange, degrading and humiliating, and it didn't make sense to me because I was raised, I think, with the idea that, my body was good and it wouldn't fail me. And it never had so far, so I couldn't see all of this. We'll have a forceps delivery because it's your first baby, because if we let things go the natural way, it would cause the baby to have brain damage. And yet, even though I tried not to have drugs, I tried to resist, they overwhelmed me and forced me to have a spinal anesthesia and a forceps delivery. I knew I didn't need that. And it was a very disturbing and depressing thing to happen. Not too long later, my husband at that time, my first husband, we went to California to join the hippies, and we were near 30 at the time. We were older. But we were very much drawn by the idealism and the spiritual pursuit. There I met the man who's now my husband, Stephen Gaskin, who was running a class came to be called Monday Night Class. 1,500 people gathered every week after the group built up, and they talked about sex and psychedelics and the Vietnam War and generation gap and nonviolence versus violence, politics, spirituality, all the different world religions. And a lot of preachers at some point asked my husband to make a lecture tour because they liked what he was saying. He was saying, you need to be preachers. We need spiritual guides through this time. So they asked him to make a speaking tour, and he went to recess the class for a time. Several hundred hands went up and said, can we come on this tour with you? At the time, we were living in a school bus camper.
I read about that, yeah.
So he said, yeah, all these people could come. So we were traveling around the United States through the fall and winter of 1970, 71, with about 400 people in school buses. And this is, through the winter when it's very cold, and then babies began being born. We had lectures every now and then. Turn off my watch. So I attended my first birth in a parking lot at the University of Northwestern near Chicago in October 25 years ago. And fortunately for me and the mother, she'd had 2 babies before, like me in the hospital, very bad experiences. And this time she wanted to be at home, and home was her little camper, and she was traveling. So she asked my husband if he would attend. Actually, her husband asked, but he was about to go in and lecture. And the reason they called on him was because he was a little bit older, he had more world experience, he'd been in a war. And I guess they thought if he could survive a war, a birth would be okay.
So what happened if
I volunteered to go because I knew he had a room full of people waiting to listen to him talk. So I went in, and I'd never seen a photograph or anything, but she looked so beautiful to me, I just gasped and looked at her. And I think she found it nice to look at me because I was so respectful. And pretty soon she had the baby, and the baby, everything went normally, so there were no problems, and I thought I had seen a miracle, which I had. And after that, I got some training from a doctor who had read about us in the newspapers, an obstetrician.
But so I understand, nobody was
trained.
certified to train.
No one at all.
So what did you do with the umbilical cord? How did
We
you-
had a
how did you-
midwifery manual with us that was written for midwife missionaries who would be going to, I think, China or perhaps Mexico. I don't remember exactly. But it was written in English, and so it was just a very slim volume that had the basics. And in fact, for the second birth, I got that manual and I studied it. Well, I started to study it. I got to the birth, and this time there was such excitement that instead of just the family there, the whole bus was full of people. And so my friend and I, who had been at the first birth, and she and I were very close, we agreed with each other that we would kick the extra men out because there was no reason for them to be there. And so we found we had the agreement between us, and we got it with the mother and the father, and we said, okay, well, these guys have to go. But we couldn't think of a good reason. It still seemed too crowded, but no good reason why we should kick someone else out rather than us to leave. So we didn't tell the women to leave. And I then picked up the midwifery manual, what to do if the baby doesn't breathe. And a woman came over, saw me reading that, and took it away from me and said, don't read that, you'll make it happen, which was a foolish thing to say. And I shouldn't have let her intimidate me from reading it, but I did. I was very shy at that time. And so when the baby was born, sure enough, the baby didn't breathe. So one of the women left that bus and went right over to where my husband was and said, the baby was born, everything's okay. But he could tell that everything was not okay. He came right over, picked up the baby and said, in cases like this, gave the baby a breath. And she breathed and cried and is an intelligent 25-year-old now.
Right.
So it was just a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Well, after that, I memorized the book, and I didn't ever let anybody, take over that way again. And after the very next birth, which was the first one where I was, in fact, taking the place of a midwife, not just a bystander, we came to Rhode Island. We were parked in a park there where an obstetrician had read about us in the newspaper and seen pictures of the babies and thought, here's a woman that needs training. So he came over, knocked on the side of our bus and offered to give me a seminar on how to be a safe midwife. So he gave me about an hour's training, hands-on, starting from the very beginning. He had to teach me how to take a blood pressure so I could do prenatal care properly, how to palpate and how to tell. He gave me credit for intelligence, gave me his book, study the book, but how to do all the things that weren't in the book, sterile technique, how to give an injection, how to do CPR, how to deal with a cord that was wrapped around the baby's neck tightly, all of these things, how to stop a hemorrhage. And in the next birth, I had to deal with the tightly wrapped cord, I had to start the baby breathing, and I had to stop a hemorrhage, but I was able to do these things.
How did you deal with the seizures?
What we did was we didn't have any until birth 187. And so apparently, we were so on to the instinctual part of childbirth, which is the majority of it if you work enough in preparation for childbirth. Almost every woman can do it because we're evolved to be able to give birth. It's only in the last 2 or 3 generations that we've had hospital birth, and so the cesarean section is like something that we've only seen explode in the last 20 years. When I became a midwife in 1970, our cesarean section rate in the United States was only 5%, and we still had doctors who knew how to attend the birth of twins. We had doctors who knew how to attend the birth of a breech baby, and now there are almost none. And I know how, while almost all American doctors don't know how anymore. I lived in the country after we finished our traveling. This group had formed together into a community because of having these babies and having these strong experiences together. We didn't want to split apart again. So we decided that we would put all our money and pool it and take it and buy a big piece of land in some of the states where we traveled. And we settled on Tennessee because it was a warm climate and because the people were very friendly to us. We didn't know that there was a tradition of more recent of home birth and midwives in Tennessee. So it in that way it was serendipitous that we landed there, because I was able to find a doctor to work with who was used to home birth because of a large old order Amish community that lived nearby. So he had 16 years experience with them, and he knew that even though the American books on childbirth will tell you that home birth, they'll leave the impression that home birth is not even to be thought of, it's just too dangerous to even consider. And yet he knew that that impression was false, because he saw fewer complications with these Amish women, even though they're having a baby every year. Some of these women would have 15 babies or 18 or 20 babies, and these would be attended at home. So,
Do you train people now?
well, we've done some. We've had a tremendous number of visitors from Europe since my book was published in 1975 and then revised in 1978. We got a lot of midwives over from Sweden. We had a few from Netherlands, but more from Germany. Germany and England, Scotland, Wales, Australia, places like that. And then we get a lot of people who had hospital training in the U.S. who want to see what a normal birth looks like, because they may have gone through their entire training. And every woman that they've ever seen labor has been under the influence of many different kinds of medications, so that they're not seeing what childbirth is like in the natural state.
So how do you approach the spiritual side of it?
Okay. I want to back up too and answer your question about the cesareans. Of course, we go into the hospital for them. You know, midwife doesn't do this, but what we found is that our cesarean rate is so very much lower than the national average. In 1993 in the U.S., our rate is 24%, almost 25% of women are having cesarean section in the United States. Some hospitals, 50%. 50%, 70% in some hospitals. With us, 1.8%. And I think that's because we do pay attention to the spiritual side of childbirth. Because I was working only with my hands and with a book that was very brief, I was working mainly with what I observed. You know, so if I see something work, then I would do that again. And if I didn't see something work, I probably wouldn't do that again. I kept going through that book, and I found out what I need to do to keep the mother safe is keep track of her vital signs, make sure that it doesn't take too long, and make sure the baby's not in trouble. But basically, this is made to work. So I went through all the questions about, can she eat? Can she drink? Well, of course, why not? Doesn't say in the book she can't, so of course she could eat and drink. So that meant that when we had our first long labor, which went to more than 2 days, and it was a good friend of mine, it was her first birth, and it surprised me. I thought she would have her baby very quickly because she wanted a baby so much. But for some reason, and I kept checking, and everything's fine, except I'm getting tired. She's getting tired. After 2 days, I just said in frustration, "Is there anything bothering you?" And she said, "Something keeps coming back into my mind, and yeah, I guess I am worried about it." She said, "When we got married, we made up our own vows, and he wouldn't say anything about promising to be with me." And when she said that, all the hair on my arm stood up. And I could tell that something was going on very deep with that. So I went over and told my husband about that, because he had known her a long time and always sort of looked out for her. And I said, this thing happened. He said, "Well, I think they need to get married. I've always been a little bit worried about that guy." Coming from outside our group, he said, "I think they need to repeat after me the vows, and then we'll see what happens." So he sat on the bed and he explained to them, and look, so do you take this woman and all the vows they repeated through, and she had the baby within an hour. Her labor just started right in. And one that happened just right around that time too, another slow labor with a woman having first baby. She opens up for a while, and then she stays the same for a long time. And this is, of course, discouraging. So the sun came up, and she was thinking everybody in the world has slept but me, and she's pretty mournful. And someone knocks on the door again and says, "Hi, has Sheila told you about her mother yet?" And again, all the hair on my arm stood up, and the woman came in, held on to her, and she said, "Yeah, it turned out that she had been adopted, and she thought that her mother had died in childbirth." And so here was a mother afraid she was going to die, and afraid to even tell us that she was afraid of. As soon as she spoke it, it was no longer controlling her labor, and she was able to go ahead and have her baby. So when things happened like that, you know, that became a big part of the midwifery, was to make sure that all these worries were up on the surface of things and released. So that's the way we worked a lot, was to try to, I mean, to know that the father of the baby and the mother are connected, and that if he's uncomfortable and he doesn't know how to help, or maybe he's clumsy and does something that makes her angry, and she says something that makes him even more awkward, and then how do you take a situation like that and make it right so that she can go ahead and have the baby?
Do you speak with the women beforehand?
This is the best.
If they want to have a group of women around, or
yes,
the male is there or not there, or
the mother gets her wish totally about who does you want to be with her, and we caution her. Maybe it isn't good to have your mother there. It depends on your mother. You know, is your mother the person that you relax around, or does your mother put you on edge?
Right.
If she makes you nervous, then, you know, she needs to be making cookies someplace. And she doesn't need to be in your bedroom, you know.
Does the same go for the husband?
No, for the husband. The husband needs to be there because, you know, we want him to meet his child. You know, just maybe the husband is the first one who's the baby's eyes will meet with. You know, this is a very special moment, so we want the husband there. But we had to recreate. You see, it's not like having a culture here where home birth, you know, maybe you were born at home, or maybe you know, if you take it for granted, then you already have a culture there. And it's hard maybe to appreciate what it's like when you no longer have that, and people don't have the idea that this is even normal behavior when it's the way that everyone is born. So you have to prepare the men. And what I found was I had to have a sense of humor, and I had to have a lot of input from my husband, who let me know what are the things that men worry about, and how to relieve that, so that I'm able to relax the husband. I know the kind of jokes to tell. I know what he needs to know, so that he goes, okay, I can breathe, I can eat. I mean, I will tell him that, you know, we want you to eat. You know, you're not supposed to become a martyr and only eat what she eats because she's living off. I think women have a tremendous amount of endurance and can withstand the long hours sometimes of childbirth. And that it gives a new respect for women, for when men to see how it happens, how she does it. And they'll see a power in her that if it's all behind closed doors, or if she's given drugs, then he doesn't get this admiration that I think is so important.
How do you work with the traumatization of men? For example, some men, or a lot of men I heard, get traumatized by seeing or looking at the vulva, being raptured and seeing this child coming through. And then somehow afterwards they don't even dare to touch the woman anymore, because that's the other side of it.
I've heard of that, you know, but I've only seen it in magazines. I've never met anybody that came through our clinic that felt that way. I think we midwives are very comfortable about talking about sexual matters, because it's so obvious that when birth is happening the way it's meant to, is a very sexual matter. And what the sounds that the woman is making when she's having the baby might sound like she's having sex. We would like it to be that way, because of course that's less painful, that's more physiologic, you know, better for the baby. And if the whole thing has that feeling about it, then when it is time for sex after the child's born, it's not so different. I mean, you have your child, it's not. I think that those thoughts must come from watching childbirth in a very clinical, surgical way, where the people who are taking care of her are not your friends, who aren't, you don't have a heart connection with. And then, to me, it's a psychedelic experience to be in labor and to have a child. And for me, it was very interesting to read that Dr. Albert Hoffman was actually studying and was the person who synthesized the oxytocin drugs. Did you know that?
No.
That when you want to stop a hemorrhage, see, the old midwives long ago knew that you would use the ergot fungus, and that this would cause the uterus, the strongest muscle in the body, would contract, and it was life-saving. And they knew this, you know. So I think he was onto that from the old, I don't know, witch's brew information that you can find in old books. But he was trying to synthesize in the laboratory we call it methergine or oxytocin. Oxytocin is a class of drugs that makes the uterus contract this way. Well, that's a very close cousin of LSD.
Well, do you give that beforehand she goes in labor, or she
No,
just after
well,
they
you
do
give it if she's bleeding after she's had the baby, and say the uterus doesn't stay hard. Just to give a little of it, it gets hard right away. So it's a life-saving drug, and it was that the doctor on the caravan gave me that was life-saving. So when I read in Dr. Hoffman's autobiography that he synthesized that drug so close to childbirth, and that LSD came from his research with sort of a second cousin once removed of LSD, it explained to me my experience when I took LSD after I'd had a child. The third trip, I thought, I have felt this before. This feels like labor. And what I noticed about labor, before they gave me any drugs, and nobody was with me, I had no midwife. My husband was with me part of the time rubbing my back, but I remember looking at a blank wall and seeing beautiful colored patterns there. And I was imagining myself to be a mountain lion. Nobody had told me to do that, and we had no childbirth preparation class, but I used to, as a kid, pretend that I was an animal a good portion of the time. And so it was a very natural thing for me to just click into that frame of mind. And when I did that, I was able to labor in a very relaxed manner. I know now that I was doing very well for having a first baby, and that was I went into being an animal. And I think if women can do that, and the men can say, yes, my wife is a primate, and so am I, and we are animals, and we ought to be able to reproduce as well as all these other animals, but we have to be a little bit comfortable here, and we don't, if you're in a hospital, you don't want it to smell like a hospital, maybe. I mean, you don't have sex in a hospital. You should have a place where it's more conducive to those kinds of hormones, because you don't want the adrenaline level to be high in the blood system. And that's what you have for your fight and your flight reaction. And that makes pain in childbirth when the adrenaline level is high. Now, we didn't know the names for all of this stuff, because we learned this all empirically and on an intuitional level. But we knew that when you would laugh, and when the husband and the wife would be smooching with each other, these were the unpainful births.
And the kissing.
And the kissing, exactly. So people learned kissing. Okay, well, a lot of people think, well, what would you want to do that for? But because it takes away the pain. Is that a good enough reason? I think so.
And it relaxes the vulva.
Absolutely.
It's a connection to it.
And I learned, I used to wonder why I used to take care of women of different races. And I never saw an Indian woman tear, and I never saw an African American woman tear. But only the Caucasian women, and not all of them, of course, but some. And usually, a woman with a good diet doesn't. But if she gets in too big a hurry, and she tries to push the baby out too fast, and maybe all the people around her, somebody's doing this, and somebody's doing this, and somebody's over here shouting at someone else, that makes her almost more like brittle. And if you want the woman to be absolutely pliable, then you have to have very peaceful consciousness, this is the kind of, you want this, when the mother's like this in between her contractions, she'll be fine. But if she's all agitated and her forehead's all wrinkled up and she's clenching her jaws and she's got herself into some kind of writhing, then she needs somebody to handle her in a way that makes her relax. Or she needs somebody to say something that makes her laugh.
Water birth.
Water birth is something that we had not too much experience with because we had so few bathtubs. So it wasn't something we were able to experiment with very much on the farm, but whenever we could, have access to a bathtub, of course we discovered that a woman in water will be much more comfortable than not. And again, because we had so few and we were able to work out other ways to manage pain, we don't have a lot of pools and things like that set up. And on the whole, I think we were meant to give birth in air. So we ought to be able to do that. I don't think it's the answer toward making, you know, all the women comfortable in childbirth, but it certainly helps to put a pool of water in a hospital. It'll really help take the edge down and avoid, I think, the overuse of medications, which is so easy to abuse. In the United States, I mean, that's one of the most common causes of maternal mortality is overuse of anesthesia and overuse of cesarean section, because both cause complications that can kill women. And so we have women in the United States who are so afraid of pain that they don't know that they're taking on an additional risk not to give birth normally and vaginally.
Instead of trusting.
Yeah.
So summing up, is there still mystery in birth?
I think there's a great deal of mystery in birth, and I think it's because things can happen when women are there that a terrific degree of relaxation could be attained. And when, if you have a strange man there, he can have an influence on the birth that he doesn't intend, and that we don't have as part of our folk knowledge anymore. Used to be in the medical books of more than 100 years ago that if a doctor came into a woman's bedroom, her labor would stop or slow down. And of course that's still true, it's just that we don't know it anymore. So that's, I think, the mystery, and that's the challenge, and that's what I like so much about the magic of video, because I can video births that I can then show at a medical school. I could show them things that they would never see.
Okay, this part is, you know, this
This
is the point. Now, how about Tim? Both of you know Tim Leary.
Can I just hold it just 1 second while I rearrange the mic?
Yeah.
It's not great.
I batted it enough. It's okay. Boom, boom. But I hope that's not too much.
Okay, then in the meantime, this is the book, huh?
Yeah.
Is it possible to keep a copy, or can we buy it here?
Oh, I can.
Okay. And then
I've got a few
This
copies
is-
still in Dutch.
I saw about 15 births myself.
Did you? Yeah.
this is NTSC. Oh, it is a PAL version.
Now this one is like breech births.
But it's a PAL version.
Yeah.
Can you send us one?
Playing my birth.
Oh well,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, we copy this, because that is really what we would like to do. The feeling
Now-
I get here about a program about this is really a late night program about birth, yeah? Isn't
Yeah.
it?
Probably so. Yeah.
Just editing Ishtara's birth.
What?
I'm just editing Ishtara's birth.
It stars. Oh, your son's birth.
Yeah, my daughter.
So,
Yeah, she was birth. Actually, many people are born at home.
of course, yeah, yeah. This is the one country where a sizable percentage
Yeah, but
still
still.
do, but you still have the same
then
pressures,
we
don't
have
you?
more
It's the same pressure. It's still the same thing about what you're talking about. A strange doctor comes in,
Yeah,
you know, all
Yeah.
these
yeah.
hospital-
technological birth
technological stuff,
happens
you
every.
know, where
Okay.
it's very
The greater interest in
Well, I'm
is the
not sure.
subject. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
You know
What I
this
would
one?
like to know is how you met him.
How did I meet him?
How did you meet
Um,
Tim Leary? What do you think about him over the years?
Oh well, I could say that yeah, I could say something. I took acid because I went to a lecture of his in Chicago when I had a brand new baby, I think. Yeah.
What impression did Leary make in those days?
What impression did he make? I was fresh back to the United States. I was, I think I just had a baby when we went to, no, I couldn't have. No, I was pregnant. We drove 70 miles to Chicago. It was very exciting because we knew of him from reading some magazine, I can't remember what it was, in Singapore about people were taking acid, a la Aldous Huxley said that it was a good idea, that you would have major religious experiences, and I had a lot of gone through a period of a lot of religious questioning. I'd gone through my midlife crisis early. I think I was 25, and I was watching the Vietnam War come on. I was watching the civil rights struggle. I was looking at my country through the perspective you get when you leave it, the only way you can really get a look at it. And I didn't like what I saw. But then with this spiritual awakening going on the West Coast for the first time in my life, I think I felt very part of something, and I wanted to go become part of that. And of course, Timothy Leary was the strongest voice in, encouraging you to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And I remember the lecture. I remember him wearing these white clothes, being barefoot on the stage. I don't remember what he said except those 6 words. But because he had been through academia and out the other side, I thought that he was opening up. He was pointing to a way that I was very much interested in. Nonviolent ways of solving problems through change of consciousness, and looking at, he had the boldness to think about changing the whole way that people thought, and that was so clearly necessary that we had to have like a flock of birds, change direction and go a safer way.
Did you reconnect with him afterwards? Did you have a personal
I've
contact
seen
with
him, well, he's had, I'm sure, no, actually I didn't meet him, and we didn't have a personal contact. And then when we went out to California, I'm trying to remember what was the first time I saw him in person. If I remember right, it was something called the celestial synapse, and he was taking refuge under bleachers with our daughter, while chaos was going on in this hall, and Stephen went out and blew a horn and kind of got the energy more organized again. But it was there was a microphone, and you didn't know who would be talking next and whether they would be saying something wise or would it be somebody's crazy ego trip. So it was a chaotic scene. And I think I saw him right around the time he was running for governor.
But what made you trust him? What made you trust
What
him?
made
So that
well, I think that it's hard to say. I think it probably that he had the background of a psychologist and an academic, and that he could talk that game, but that he also saw that he'd gone as far as he could go with that, and that we could have everybody in the country become a psychologist, and we'd still have serious problems in the United States. We didn't have the culture that we were accessing in a meaningful way to where we could break through and deal with our problems in a helpful way. I think a lot of what the 60s meant was for black people in the United States, it was using the law and the courts to come to equality. And I think what people learned in the 70s, 80s, and beginning to in the 90s is that while you need that, that can't be all of what you do, because if you just have these separate groups, and it doesn't matter what the laws are, if the people hate each other, you can mess up situations where you do have good laws. So Timothy Leary saw beyond, and he was very brave to do what he did and throw away what he threw away for a clear vision. And I guess I saw that he looked farther down the road and looked with a wider vision than most people.
So he came to the farm?
No, he didn't come to farm. I'm talking about 1966 probably. In the middle part of the year, just before I had my baby, I think we listened to him talk. So we decided after we had the baby, we will go to California and we will find the hippies and we will take LSD, and that's what we did. So I think that it was the year that I was taking LSD pretty regularly, and you couldn't take it around Stephen and not be involved in cosmic trips. Very, very strong teachings, and he never sort of got it the way Tim said, you're supposed to have the nice set and setting. We, for the most times, were in our apartment, and then people would come over, or we would be in our apartment, and then we would go out. And so we had very interesting and cosmic trips with profound psychological rearrangements going on. And it was sometime before we actually had a trip out in nature, which was a different sort of thing. But there was a lot of discovery and getting to know your subconscious, which was not always the most fun thing, but it was certainly valuable. And learning how to relax in spite of other people not being relaxed. These were very important skills for me as a midwife, because I then learned to how to be relaxed when other people aren't, how to deal with a crisis situation.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, because you tapped into another realm. So.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's nice. It's,
Now, some of them are done before AIDS, so I'm not wearing gloves. And so if any of those images are shown, it actually needs to be explained, because I don't want them to think that I don't wear gloves now. I wear gloves. You know what I'm saying?
that's not an issue here.
That's not an issue here.
Do you think that's an issue?
Of course it would be.
I think it's good to do.
Professionally it will be.
Well, you supervise these
And,
things.
and there, let me tell you something also that you'll see, is that
Or SVH.
I use my hands more than your average Dutch midwife. So what I